Hi, I'm Emily Previty, and this is Follow PA, the Pennsylvania Capital Star's podcast focused on policy affecting Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. Pennsylvania lawmakers got the state budget done within a couple weeks after their deadline this year. A dramatic departure from some other years in the recent past, including 2025, when negotiations lasted 135 days. A big factor seems to be whether an election is coming up, as it is this year for half the state Senate, the entire state House, and the governor's office. In fact, according to our analysis of timelines during the past 2 decades, budgets are not only more likely to be late, but they also take about 3 times as long, conservatively, to negotiate during non-election years compared to when lawmakers have campaigning on their summer calendars like they do right now. So we quantified this premise held by people who work in Harrisburg and/or are careful observers. But we wanted a bit more context, so I looked back another 15 years, all the way to 1992, and saw that back then, late budgets weren't a thing. Part of it was the Republican trifecta in state government, in effect most of that time. But that's not the only reason, as several people who watch this closely told me. Also, these protracted negotiations come with costs. Issues languish until the budget's done. After certain points, schools and counties might need to borrow money or tap savings. Nonprofits, community service providers, other contractors, after enough time, some of them might end up laying off staff, cutting programs, or even folding completely, which is what happened in Pennsylvania last year. Even with this current budget, there are concerns about impacts not too far down the road from some of the financial maneuvers used to get it right on paper. I also wondered whether drawn-out budget talks ever result in something beneficial. And with elections seeming to be strongly correlated, do voters even care about that? I put those questions to several people who've participated directly in the budgeting process or paid attention to it for a long time, and I couldn't choose just one. So today, you'll hear my conversations with Christopher Nicholas, a longtime Republican strategist and founder of Eagle Consulting, and Berwood Yost, director of the Center for Opinion Research at Franklin and Marshall College. Both conversations have been edited for length and clarity, and we'll start with Chris, who has a podcast and newsletter of his own, PA Political Digest. So we are in the summer and are not dealing with the budget impasse. And that's nice for us. But why is that? You kind of hear people saying, well, it's an election year, so that's why the budget has been done on time. And I wondered if the numbers would bear that out, and they do. We looked at the past 20 years of budgets, past dates, election versus non-election years, and it was 80% of budgets were late during non-election years versus 60% during election years, and this is in the past 20 years. And during non-election years, negotiations went 3 times as long, conservatively. We had some phased budgets that had multiple passage dates, and we used the shorter of the options for those. But if you're going to use the latter passage dates, it just exacerbates the trend. That's what we found, and that's what I've been calling people about this week to see, what they make of it.
As I wrote in my PA Political Digest newsletter, I think Team Shapiro blinked when it came to the budget, and they just wanted to kind of bypass that because things are going good for them in the governor's race. And so they didn't want to add any new wrinkles to that. If you look at the spend number, it was way below what he wanted. They didn't tackle any of the thorny sticking points like skill games or some of the other things that he had finagled into his own budget to prop up the revenue numbers. So part of it is they kick the can down the road, and that's just what legislators and governors do a lot. So that didn't surprise me. Nowadays, unlike 25, 30 years ago, there's no consequences if the budget is late. Pretty much everybody still gets paid. So I think this was, Team Shapiro said, we don't want any big conflagrations because we're doing well now. So let's keep the status quo humming along, and the status quo is let's pass the budget and move on to the next thing.
Do you hear that when it's an election year, people sort of assume that the budget's basically going to be on time? I would agree with you. 12 days is not really late, especially compared to what we've dealt with previously.
Yeah, I mean, just remember the House is up every 2 years, the Senate only half of them. So I think there's more of this coming from the House side because they have to get home and campaign. But then when you look at it, of the 203 state House seats, I bet 150 don't have to break a sweat to get reelected. They're either in overwhelmingly one party districts or they don't even have an opponent on the ballot in the fall or they don't have anyone they have to worry about. Uh, Ironically, the Senate races this year have been uh, seeing more battles, especially in the primary with all those Republicans and otherwise safe seats getting over the skill games issue. I think a lot of people were thinking, let's push all these big battles till after the election.
Underlying that thinking on either side, on both sides, is it's a timing thing. So they want to get that campaign, as you alluded to, but then also avoid having controversial discussions, deliberations, votes in the news that are going to, especially, I guess, in seats that aren't safe, that are going to bring issues to the fore that they'd rather not have while they're trying to run for reelection.
A lot of what happens in campaigns is who controls the conversation, right? So if both parties think they're going to be in a better position later, and both parties think they have good talking points now, if you interject something new to it, well, that's an unknown. So what are the big new things this year? Well, an old one is skill games. Okay. That has all four caucuses divided, House R's and D's, Senate R's and D's. And then this whole issue with data centers, which in the last 4 months, public opinion has shifted totally against data centers and anything connected to data centers. So both parties are trying to figure that out. It's brand new. Legislators and, executives like the governor, uh, they have problems with fast moving issues because the ground underneath them is moving. It's not settled. I mean, Josh Shapiro, there's a story last week, I guess, in the Inquirer about he worked with Amazon to develop his new program to quote unquote rein in data centers. And he was working with, according to this Inquirer story, the Amazon lobbyists to make sure they were okay with all of it. So it's such a fast moving issue. No one wants to get caught, what I would say, flat footed. So again, let's push that can down the road. Now, I don't think the data center can is going to be pushed down the road because you're going to see advertising about it from both sides in a lot of districts. But the budget for some people is literally 90% of what they do in government or as a lobbyist, right? And so you get to that point, and boy, I don't want anything to mess it up because I've been working for a year or 2 years on my pet project or on this particular program. There's a whole set of people here that make their vacation schedules based around what they think the state budget's going to be. If you go 50 miles from here and talk to a regular person, a civilian, June 30th is not some super big date on their calendar, right? But here in and around Harrisburg, whether it's legislators, lobbyists, maybe some members of the press, it's a big deal. I was at a dinner party with some hangers on like me and couple legislators, and they didn't know what was in the budget. They're not really into top leadership, but the the dance card had been revealed to them. So they kind of knew what the schedule was. The top leaders kind of decide those big things. So there's really, 4 or 5 people deciding this. The Senate Republicans, because they control that chamber, the House Democrats, because they control that chamber, and then somebody from the governor's office. If not the governor, then his chief of staff, chief counsel, whatever. So that's what it comes down to. If you look back over the last 20 years, Emily, you said for your analysis there at Pennsylvania Capital Star, of those 20 years, 16 of them have been under Democratic governors, and 4 of them have been under Republican governors. 1 term of Shapiro, 2 terms of Wolf, one term of Corbett and the last term of Rendell. That's our last 20 years, right? Divided government except for the Corbett years, and that was all Republican.
The years that it's a trifecta, you don't have the late budgets to the same extent. I mean, there was nothing. I looked at the 15 years before that, and there was not much to say because budgets were being passed early much of the time because it was a trifecta, Republican trifecta so often, except for Corbett's last year. The budget was 10 days late, which
It was Wolf's first year, Emily. That was really the tough part because that part of that budget didn't get passed until the next February when you're on top
yes.
of the
Yeah.
next cycle beginning. So that was the hard one. And the next year after that was not quite as bad. And then Wolf's last 2 years, he learned his lesson. So I think a lot of governors come in saying, I am the unitary, right? There's only one governor. There's 203 House members and 50 senators. So I'm going to bring you to heel, right? Because I'm the boss, I'm the governor. And then they learn that it just doesn't work that way. So it's always the learning process of a governor. A little quirk is if you're an incoming governor for the first time, you don't give your budget speech the first Tuesday in February. You do it either at the end of February or the first Tuesday in March, because they would be not necessarily starting from scratch, but not rolling on from the year before. And then the other thing too is you have all of these deals that are made, whether public or private. We couldn't do XYZ this year, but we'll get to XYZ next year. If you bring in a new governor, well, a lot of those deals get blown up. So I think Democrats say post election is good because we'll have the trifecta, right? And even though the trifecta doesn't start until January, when the new legislators get sworn in, we'll have a chance to roll some issues, right? Because the Republicans will be desperate to make any deal they can before they lose, all of their relevance. And for Republicans, they think, well, we can have control of, if not the governorship, then at least both houses of the legislature. So we'll have more control, and the Democrats will be desperate to make any deal they can before the new people come in January, before they lose in my scenario, control of the state house. So a lot of it is gambling on what the dice are going to roll for you on November 3rd.
Sure. And so there's a cost to budget negotiations. Can you recall one where there was a breakthrough of some kind?
I think back to the gaming bill, which created the first non state lottery gambling in the state, the casinos, the land-based casinos. That was a long time gestating. It took a couple years in Rendell's time to get everybody on board. And then he made a deal with John Brazel, the Republican Speaker of the House, also from Philadelphia. More recently, what I think one of the game changers has been the Senate Majority Leader Joe Pittman. And as he describes it, finding money in the couch cushions, right? So this year and the previous year, and they went out and found money that had been appropriated in previous years, but for a million different reasons had not been expended. And there was an extra, 18 million. But, once you scrape your couch cushions for the change, you only do that once,
Right.
right? Because you've scrounged up all the quarters you dropped into them. And lo and behold, this year, this budget just passed. They did it again. They went and found another extra hundred millions of dollars in the so-called state couch cushions, which I know surprised me because I thought you would have found all that money last year and brought it in, but there was more. So that to me has been a very interesting development because you're essentially respending money you had already appropriated, which just never totally got out the door. I think a lot of civilians think, well, you appropriate $100 million for a program for a year, they spend $100 million and then they're done. And that's just not how the real world works. So you add that up over a variety of different programs and all the various nooks and crannies of the state government. And it's added up not just this year, but also last year. So I'm not going to say the couch cushions are now bare because I said that last year and I was proven to be wrong. There may be more couch cushion money. That has really softened the blow the last 2 years and helped them extend some programs without raising taxes.
We talked about scheduling. We talked about wanting not too much new or controversial in the news when running for re-election. But does a late or chaotic budget just on its face become actual material for criticism by opponents against an incumbent, or not really?
Think about straws on the camel's back. On the TV show I do, This Week in Pennsylvania, I'm the Republican analyst. We have a couple different women who do the Democratic analyst part. And I'm always cautioning them and the host, Dennis Owens, that the cadre of people who really care and live and breathe about the state budget is pretty small. Okay. It could fit in the Harrisburg Hilton Hotel comfortably. What it can add to as a straw on the camel's back is, boy, those people in Harrisburg just can't get their shit together. They can't do X, they can't do Y, they can't even pass a budget on time. So it can add to that. And if you're a challenger going up against an incumbent, that's a good argument for you to use to say, look, it's time for a change. I've always cautioned people, don't talk about the fact that the budget is late because people can't understand that. Talk about the fact that the school district can't pay the teachers to run band camp in August. Okay. You have to bring it down to a personal level because all of those government entities have surpluses. They have, extra stored away. But if the budget's not done, what they do sometimes is they just stop spending any unnecessary money because they don't know when the money's going to keep coming. So there's like a lull, even though you're going to get this money. That's an easier way to explain it to civilians because then they get, oh, yeah, the township always repaves the roads in the summer and now they're not doing it. Why? The state budget. Oh, and then they can relate to that.
So, yes, but highlighting real world impact would matter for that, or otherwise, don't bother. As a campaign manager, would you ever tell someone, a client, to prioritize wrapping up a budget before the fall, or is that not really how it works from that side?
I've never had that conversation with someone, right? I mean, what I would do in that situation is I'd sketch out 2 different scenarios for them or 3 different scenarios for them on time, pretty much on time like this year, or really, behind the 8 ball and taking a long time. Last year, it stretched into like late September and October. And by then, it was seeping out into the real world because you had county commissioners and school board directors and borough council people agitating about it and telling their people about it. All those groups have state organizations, so they were getting on about it. So it had spread outside just the Capitol with an O building. And again, if you're incumbent, you don't like change. You like the status quo because the status quo was you being a state house member or a state senator. If you're a challenger, well, you want to change the status quo because that would help you. If it's an open seat where there's no incumbent and both candidates are new, that's a little bit different.
Sure. And I think you touched on this earlier, but from your standpoint, does a Republican controlled Senate treat an election year budget deadline differently than maybe a Democratic controlled House does from a strategy standpoint?
Democrats took control of the House by 1 vote in 2022. We had these big state house elections in 2024, and the total margin didn't change. Still 102, 101. So now we're going into our second cycle of 102, 101. Plus, we've had all of these special elections, which has not changed the balance. Having come up through the House Republican Campaign Committee, you're always used to having more balls in the air, right? Because the state Senate people will come and say, oh boy, it's a really tough year. I'm targeting 3 races. And the House people on both sides will laugh at them and say, well, I'm targeting 15 races, right? But I don't think state Senate Republicans and House Democrats would look at it differently. They have different priorities, obviously. But I think they would both look at it as, well, we're in the majority, okay? If I were the Democrats in the Senate, I would have wanted a long budget process because then they have to beat incumbent Republicans the way the calendar is, right? They have to beat incumbent Republicans to get to their magic number of either 25 or 26. So if I were them, and I'm not them, obviously I'm a Republican, I would have wanted an overdue budget because that would have given me more ammunition to go up against the incumbents. So But if I were the House Democrats, I wouldn't want that, right? I would want to have everything stay calm and the same.
So when I only looked back to 1992 and there were no late budgets, there were a couple of years when there wasn't a trifecta. There were three, actually, and the budget was on time. And then when Rendell, during his first year, it was 176 days late, which is long. So is that something that was expected to happen?
Well, Rendell's first term was started in 2003.
Right.
So in 2002, he beat Bob Casey Jr., who was then Auditor General. And the state party endorsed Casey, organized labor endorsed Casey, and Rendell won like 10 counties in the Democratic primary, but they were the populous counties, and he swept a victory. He had a fairly easy, as it turned out to be, general election. And then he ran into reality, which was a lot of people, especially outside the Philadelphia suburbs, were like, who the hell's Ed Rendell? And I don't care who you are, Ed Rendell. So, he kind of got a little bit out over his skis, as the saying is, and realized that, hey, if you're some state senator from Crawford County, you don't give a rat's what the guy from Philadelphia who's now governor says you have to do. And as I reminded people back then, the Philadelphia City Council at that time was probably 14 Democrats to 3 Republicans. So he never had to negotiate with the Republicans. He just had to fight within his own party. And then you get to the whole state, and it's really different. So that, to me, I think is why it was, would you say, 176 days? I mean, that's basically half the year. Mm-hmm. And they kind of bifurcated the budget and passed a few things for especially the school districts, then left the rest of it for later. That was really bad. And the old rules were in effect, so you couldn't pay state workers. I mean, I've lived in Harrisburg for a long time. I was living here then. Literally, the State Employees Credit Union was giving state workers kind of what I would call loans in lieu of paycheck. So if you were a state worker and your paycheck, your gross pay was $1,000 every 2 weeks, they would loan you $1,000 every 2 weeks, as long as you signed over your paycheck to them, because once you got paid, you were going to get all that back pay, and then the credit union could get paid off. And banks did that too. So it was just amazing. It was a big hit to the Harrisburg economy because so many of the state employees are based here. Once they changed the law, it was like, yeah, whatever. You guys fight it out. I'm still getting my paycheck every 2 weeks.
Right. And the schools probably get it the most dramatically in terms of affecting the broadest
Yeah, but that
ends the summer,
I mean, no school's going to suffer in July or August, but October, yes. Okay. So it changed into a very slow motion snowball that took 4 months to get there. So,
right. Yeah. All right. I don't have anything else. I really appreciate you making the time.
Take care, Emily. See you. Nice to be with you.
Bye. The day after I talked with Chris, I talked with Berwood Yost. Before our conversation, he sent me some past polling results from Franklin and Marshall College's Center for Opinion Research, where he is the director. A representative sample of Pennsylvania voters was asked about which party was most responsible for the late state budget during multiple impasses from 2027 forward. In 2023, the choices were the governor, House Democrats, or Senate Republicans. 20% of respondents chose the governor as the most to blame. 20% chose House Dems, 32% picked Senate Republicans, and 28% said they did not know. Before 2023, it was a different question, at least for the 6 polls shared with me from 2027 forward. Respondents had 3 options: the governor, legislature, or don't know. Each time, at least half said the legislature was most to blame for the late budget, about a third chose the governor, and the remainder, which was 15% or 17% each time, said they didn't know. So with that context, let's go to Berwood.
I think the bottom line about the polling data is that there's enough blame to go around, and that governors typically aren't the ones that are perceived as being the major problem. Most people think it's the legislature that is holding up the budget process. And, I think there's some belief that by holding out, the legislature's harming the governor's standing. And we don't see that in the data. Most people blame the legislature when there's a budget impasse. And by the way, a lot of people just don't know who's to blame. So they don't know where to attribute blame. But those who do, a majority of them will blame the legislature, not the governor. And so from a pressure standpoint, the pressure of public opinion, although the governor's one person, they typically don't take the blame for it.
You sent me some numbers. I should probably send you some numbers, although some of them there's not much to see because I looked at 20 years and then I looked at 15 years before that. And as I'm sure you're familiar with, or won't be surprised to be reminded of, there were very few late budgets for many, many years in Pennsylvania. 80% of the time, budgets are late in non-election years. 60% of the time, they're late in election years. So that's a difference. But the bigger difference is when they're late during non-election years, it takes 3 times as long. It's conventional wisdom to people who have been paying attention to state budgets for years.
I mean, look, earlier this year when people asked me about the budget, I fully expected that this particular cycle, it would not be as late as normal because legislators want to get out and they want to get back to their districts and they want to do campaigning, right? There's no doubt that in an election year, there's incentives. I think the other really important thing to understand is that there weren't many late budgets before 2005 because a court ruling after that severed the requirement that state employees get paid. Prior to the time we had all these budget impasses, if there was a delay, state employees did not get paid. And that generated tremendous pressure on lawmakers to solve the issue. That changed. The Supreme Court ruling said you got to pay these people whether there's a budget or not. And all of a sudden, that pressure evaporated. And that is in part, there's 2 reasons. One, elites are more polarized and there's less cross-party conversation. But on top of that, and perhaps more important than that, is the constituency that would be in the legislature's ear, all these state employees, they're not affected the way they once were.
It's a divided government, too. There's been more divided government than the past 20 years than prior.
And politics was less polarized. You had deal makers in the legislature. You had Senator Jubileer in the Senate, and you had House Speaker Purcell in the House. You had Vince Fumo in the Senate. You have people who knew how to legislate and make deals, and that was a valued leadership trait at the time. And, the values of elected officials and elected leaders are the things they prioritize are different today.
So what do you think is taking precedence over, the ability to compromise?
Well, part of it is the increased polarization among elites. Part of it is the shifting priorities, even within parties. I think there are legitimate differences in kind of spending priorities and the belief in the role of government, state government particularly. I think all of those things play into it in recent years. Conservatives have become even increasingly interested in slowing the growth of government and reducing government programs. So, I think there are legitimate policy reasons for this, but it comes back to the polarization and partisan priorities, right?
There's a concern or a belief that rather than valuing someone, and you were naming individuals who embodied this ability to make deals, make compromises, that it could be seen by the constituency as a betrayal, perhaps, because of the polarization, rather than the ability to get a deal, get a compromise, and move on.
The other thing that's true that we haven't mentioned is that at one point we started to phase out corporate net income taxes and changing the way we tax businesses in the state. And I think there was consensus among members of both parties. And you see this today, even with Governor Shapiro continuing to reduce the corporate net income tax and a number of carry forward loss provisions, all these strange and arcane tax rules that affect businesses. That was a bipartisan compromise to start reducing that. And we've never filled the gap in the state budget produced by that change, in my opinion. And that's also another reason that things have gotten so problematic with budgets, is that we have a structural deficit. Everyone will tell you that. We've had it since we changed the way that we tax, particularly businesses. And so the arguments have often been around how do you fill that hole? And there's a lot of political point scoring that goes on and talking about priorities and all those things. But this is also part of the complicated equation related to budget impasses.
Right. And regarding that, this year, the legislature, they actually have two court orders, one deadline they've already blown that isn't really related to the budget. And they're also required by October to come up with a system for regulating skill games. And they didn't tackle that, even though there's revenue that could be generated there prior to passing the budget.
Probably $1 billion from the estimates I've seen. That the Supreme Court decision would give them cover to do that. And they didn't take it, which surprised me. I thought that the effort by the skill games industry to take out some incumbent Republicans might have also been a motivator to get it done. But no, they didn't. So I think that alone tells you the complications.
It's interesting, though, because people kind of glaze over, especially outside of Harrisburg, when you talk about the budget and this being an election year. To make that tie to skill games generating revenue, the lobbying complication in that layer, and, you know, the fact that this could cover the Medicaid expenses that got shoved off. And if we don't do that, then it's going to be really expensive. Even more so if it results in some kind of borrowing, and on and on and on. It like snowballs. So I think people would care if they were consistently reminded, but people are busy, and it's just not something that, until it's really affecting people personally, they're not going to be inundating their lawmakers with.
They'll be calling about specific programs, but at the same time, they would be calling about tax increases, right? So there's representatives have to balance all those concerns.
So we just came out of an impasse last year where we had school districts and counties borrowing, some nonprofits and other small business contractors that were affected had to make decisions, cut programming, and lay people off. So we know that they can be costly, but in theory, a budget impasse could be beneficial if out of the negotiation comes some kind of policy breakthrough or a policy or a revenue-related policy breakthrough. So can you recall that happening in the past with something that was a long time coming? Or
I can give you two examples. Gambling, legalization of gambling in Pennsylvania. That process drug on for a long time until, you know, there was a general acknowledgement that we were losing revenue to other states by not having a gambling industry, and you know, that became a source of revenue for the state. So legalized gambling is one, tobacco taxes are another. We saw increases in the tobacco tax over time as attitudes changed about that particular product. So we've seen it before with certain sources of revenue. The example that's the negative, that's been a long time discussed but not really used, is actually shale tax revenue. You know, generating, I mean, Pennsylvania is the only shale producing tax that doesn't have an extraction tax. That could be a huge source of revenue for the state, but that's been untapped since the shale boom took off in the early 2000s. So you have two cases of long-term conversation, particularly legalized gambling is probably the best one, but the fact that we've never been able to enact an extraction tax on shale gas in this state. So.
Do you perceive or do you hear articulated by lawmakers themselves, people who have worked in campaigns, articulating the election year effect, whether it's scheduling or not wanting controversial votes in the news or both?
No, I haven't really talked to them about that. But I think it's just evident from their behavior that they don't want to be tied to Harrisburg. They want to be out campaigning. Every vote is a potential issue. And so you pass a budget, get that behind you, get home, run for reelection. That's what you do. And I just think the incentives for having a budget closer to on time, those incentives are stronger in an election year because you don't want to be in Harrisburg negotiating over a budget.
People have talked about suspending pay or raises if the budget is late. I mean, does it seem like that would work? Given it seems like if they need to, for reasons that are closer to home, the lawmakers can come to the table and get it done.
I mean, your own data can point to this. When the government used to shut down because of a budget impasse, it generated a lot more pressure to solve the issue. Unless you're back to that, even the things that we saw happen last year where local school districts were having to take out loans and pay interest on loans, that was really harmful. But for some reason, the legislature doesn't feel that the way they felt other things. And so unless you can tie a budget impasse to some kind of service closures, it kind of slides by and no one's held responsible for it individually. And the pressures to do something are not huge, not like they used to be. And so I think we need a stronger incentive to create pressure on the legislature and the governor to do this. I mean, nothing focuses your mind and your attention like a deadline. If we had a real deadline where things changed, then we might be able to forego these or not have as many of these. Like if on July 1, if state government closed, think about the pressure that would generate, because that's what used to happen. And you can also see the analogous circumstances at the federal level when there is a government impasse or a shutdown. Things stop happening. That doesn't seem to be true in Pennsylvania anymore. So what's the problem? If state government were to close, all of those constituencies would start contacting the legislators for relief. Unless you have something, that legislators are going to hear feedback about.
Right, but there isn't like an opening to undo that court decision, though, is there?
I'm not a lawyer, but it would be worth talking about. I mean, I would imagine there could be legislation passed that says no budget means no government functions.
Right. Okay, well then wouldn't that run afoul of this Supreme Court decision? But to your point, as we've learned, sometimes the possibilities are endless when it comes to openings for undoing certain things. So
I mean, I tell people all the time, if you think politics, if you think anything is ever settled in our politics, you're mistaken, right? I mean, there is always an avenue for trying to change a perception on a policy and to enact some change to the way we view things and the way that we think about it from a legal standpoint. I mean, the Trump administration has taught us that if it's taught us nothing else. Nothing's ever settled.
we have Digital Story coming soon with even more perspectives, including from sitting lawmakers. To check it out, keep an eye on the Pennsylvania Capitol Star's website and newsletter, The Morning Guide. Thank you for listening to Follow PA, the Pennsylvania Capital Stars podcast focused on how policy affects Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you've heard, we'd love it if you'd recommend it to a friend. To stay updated on the latest episodes and other work by our team, you can subscribe to the Capital Stars newsletter, The Morning Guide, at penncapital-star.com, and we've included that link in the show notes. Our theme music is Dusk by Mr. Smith, courtesy of the Free Music Archive, licensed under an Attribution 4.0 international license. Follow PA is edited by the Capital Stars editor-in-chief, Tim Lambert, and hosted and produced by me, Emily Previty. Thanks again for listening.